This is Valerie Szybala, Executive Director of the Syria Institute, and I am back to answer another question from our Q&A series. This is our fourth video, I believe. This question comes from Stephen Sharp, and he asked, what is the confidence, and this was asked last month, by the way, what is the confidence that all of these, both this week and earlier, gas attacks were entirely perpetrated by Assad? I've seen a lot of spotty reports implying that Al-Nusra Front also has access to these weapons and has used them before. Thank you for the question, Stephen. So just for a little bit of context, on April 4th, I'm sure most of you are aware, there was a large chemical attack in a town called Khan Sheikhoun in Idlib province. It killed ultimately, I don't know the final numbers, I think more than 80 people. People continued to die in hospitals for days afterwards. It injured more than 500. The question that Stephen is asking is about whether this was the Syrian government, which most are proclaiming, or it could have been from Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the alternative explanation given by Syrian government and Russian sources. So I want to start by giving you my own political military assessment, and I'd also like to bring in some additional expertise, intelligence assessments, and chemical weapons experts, what they have to say. And I'll talk a little bit about the counter narratives that are out there. So the first thing to say is that this was the Syrian government. In my experience working on Syria for years, political military analysis, this is entirely consistent with the behavior of the Syrian government. It does not seem logical, maybe from other actors, but the Syrian government does things that are illogical all the time. Particularly, it has a long track record of testing. So it will test reactions. It will slowly escalate. And before this chemical attack, Human Rights Watch documented a series of smaller nerve gas attacks in northern Syria by the Syrian government. They did not get attention either because they did not hit their targets and kill anyone, or they were in ISIS-held territory. And before that, we also have an escalating series of attacks with less deadly agents believed to be chlorine or something similar, also by the Syrian government, launched from helicopters or aircraft over the past several years. The Syrian government also has, to put it bluntly, it likes to give the middle finger to the international community. So it makes sense that an attack like this would come at a time when there is a major international conference happening in Brussels on the future of Syria. Back a couple years, an example of this, contacts I spoke with in a besieged area near Damascus capital used to joke that, not a funny joke, but they used to joke with high-level UN officials not to come to Damascus because every time they came to visit, the Syrian government would bomb this neighborhood of Douma just as a warning to the UN. So they knew that if a high-level UN official was in Damascus, they were going to get bombed in retaliation. And it's also the timing with battles going on at that point in time, the Syrian government versus opposition forces, and also with the new US administration, Syrian government testing. There's a lot about this attack that fits within the MO of the Syrian government as it has acted over the past 5-6 years of intense military escalation. Additionally, with the attack itself, there were reported airstrikes that day, including after the chemical attack, targeting the hospitals treating the victims, particularly the Al-Rahma hospital, which was the nearest one nearby. So attacks that were intended to exacerbate the pain caused by this chemical attack. So I want to bring in now some other intelligence assessments, and I will include links to all of these because I'm not claiming to be a chemical expert. So the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, international organization, since 2013 has been monthly reporting to the UN Security Council on the progress towards Syria's chemical weapons program elimination, as it agreed to in 2013 after the major attack it launched in the Ghouta surrounding areas of Damascus. Every month, it says that there are still gaps, inconsistencies in the Syrian government's reporting that need to be resolved. Although they did destroy all the chemicals that were taken out of the country, they were not able to verify the Syrian government's statement, and there are still sites that they have not been able to visit. So there were known to be gaps in Syria's chemical weapons reporting and potential violations. The Syrian government, the UN, and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, also have an additional mechanism set up where they are investigating certain attacks that have happened in recent years to actually assign blame. So far, that mechanism has determined that the Syrian government was responsible for at least 3 chlorine attacks, and ISIS was responsible for a mustard gas attack. This is not a comprehensive list. Those are just the investigations they were able to get significant or sufficient information for. No other actor in Syria is known to have used chemical weapons during the conflict in any demonstrable manner. And then we have intelligence assessments since the attack last month from OPCW, France, Turkey, and the US, all confirming that sarin was used based on samples taken from the site and from victims who were in Turkey, who were taken to Turkey. And then the US and France have also released intelligence assessments that they are certain that it was the Syrian government, based on military capabilities and intelligent capabilities that we don't have here at TSI, but I encourage you to read those reports. They contain a lot of interesting information, and I will include them all in the links below after this is posted. So then I want to talk a little bit about the bombing itself and why claims that this wasn't the Syrian government are nonsensical, basically. So we know that there was an airstrike, or a series of airstrikes on Khan Sheikhoun, that led to the chemical being released and killing dozens and dozens of people. So we have the US and France confirming that a Sukhoi 22 bomber left from the Syrian government's Shayrat air base and struck Khan Sheikhoun the morning of the attack. According to eyewitnesses and documented by Human Rights Watch and other organizations, they saw the bomb drop but did not hear an explosion. This is consistent with a chemical warhead instead of a conventional warhead. The explosions left a crater filled with liquid. According to Human Rights Watch, this is also consistent with sarin when it's at room temperature after an attack. According to US reports, intelligence assessments, the first responders to the attack were also harmed. So this is not conventional. We know it was a chemical attack because if you weren't there during the blast, and you end up getting sick. The French intelligence report confirmed that the crater that was studied in various imagery, video, and photo was consistent only with an aerial attack, meaning it was not because an airstrike bombed a site that was already there and there was an explosion on the ground. This was an explosion, or this was a bomb that came from the air. And so then there are some information actually about sarin itself. So according to the French intelligence assessment, the samples that they took of the sarin that was used at the site contained hexamine, a chemical called hexamine used as a stabilizer, and this method is known to be used and developed by the Syrian government at its Scientific Studies and Research Center in the Damascus capital in a neighborhood called Barza. So this matches known Syrian sarin previous stockpiles. And according to an expert called Dan Cazzetta, posting on a great site called Bellingcat, he explains a little bit about sarin itself and the way that it works. And I have independently reached out to a third expert to get his 2 cents on whether Dan's explanation makes sense, and he concurred. So what Dan said is, explains in his articles, which we'll also link to, is that sarin is a binary nerve agent, at least the way it's been used in the Middle East and in Syria. It's very hard to make non-binary sarin. So this means that you don't just have a stockpile of sarin, you have a stockpile of precursor chemicals, and then you mix them together shortly before you want to use the sarin. What this would mean in the explanation that was eventually landed upon by Russia and Syria, when they're saying that they bombed a chemical warehouse and that caused the attack, it would mean that in the alternative explanation that Jabhat al-Nusra that had chemical precursors, which is highly unlikely, sitting around in the same warehouse, also highly unlikely, and then when this would be bombed from the air with a conventional munition, what would happen is actually it would cause a big explosion because at least one of the precursors is highly flammable. So that's not what happened in Khan Sheikhoun. There wasn't a big explosion. And the victims that were taken to other hospitals in Turkey, notably from all of the assessments, did not show outward signs of visible trauma. So these were not explosion victims. These were chemical attack victims. And the explanation that a chemical warehouse was bombed and then sarin magically mixed itself in the air in large quantities is not plausible based on the way that sarin works. So the counter narratives that are out there that I know are confusing, and for that reason I'm really happy for this question, are what we in the US would call fake news, what I call propaganda or disinformation. They are intentional and they are meant to obfuscate responsibility, and Russia and the Syrian government are experts at using them. They have been for years. So in this case, initially you had multiple different explanations coming out of Syria and Russia about what happened. First, the Syrian government military sources denied that there was any sort of airstrike. But then, Russia said there was an airstrike, but they targeted a Jabhat al-Nusra chemical facility or warehouse on the ground. And eventually the two countries came together on this narrative. But even the narrative that they united on still has flaws that are inconsistent with what actually happened. Notably, that they say their airstrikes were several hours after the first documented records of this chemical attack took place. They also said they hit a warehouse, but satellite imagery and geolocated with photos from the ground show that there wasn't actually a warehouse struck. The nearby warehouse was left standing, and several site visits by reporters since then have confirmed that it is pretty abandoned. It doesn't seem to be used for anything, but it was not what was struck in these attacks. So even the narrative they've landed on is not real. And at the same time, if you're reading foreign language news, particularly the Arabic news, both Russian and Syrian media outlets are still shilling CW reports and Human Rights Watch reports, and then a couple of good open source investigations, including an excellent one by the New York Times, and then several by Dan at Bellingcat. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for our next Q&A.